When a constrictor coils around a pregnant feline, a young lady who has been looking after the cat is petrified. She cries out in terror, but watch who comes to her aid. Sarah squealed in fright. The enormous python was squeezing the helpless cat, and she didn't know what to do. Scanning her surroundings for something to divert the snake or assist in loosening its hold, the young lady hurriedly swiped the tears from her cheeks. She couldn't lose Bella and her unborn kittens now, but the snake was enormous, and there was no way she could free the feline alone. However, her cry drew the attention of an unsung hero, and soon they'd arrive on the scene to aid the pregnant feline. The cat and the hero would end up turning Sarah's world on its head. The young woman was a lifelong animal lover, and one day she planned to take in and save as many pets as she could. For now, though, housing a cat or canine in her small flat wasn't feasible, and it also violated house rules. Sarah looked forward to a future where she owned a lovely home with a spacious backyard, where she could provide animals with a warm refuge. For the time being, Sarah has volunteered to provide assistance to some stray animals that populate her peaceful neighborhood. There were a few cats living in the deserted area behind her street, and she started leaving out food and water for them. She was even considering finding some small shelters to provide the cats with protection from the harsh Florida weather or frequent afternoon storms. Sarah started collecting the cat food and tidbits from her kitchen and glanced out the window. Mr. Johnson was heading out with his canine, a golden Labrador named Tucker, to get their walk before the temperature surged. Every time she saw him, she felt a pang of sadness. He seemed so isolated, yet no matter how much she tried, she only got a cold good morning or good afternoon from him, and only if she initiated it. She and Mr. Johnson had moved into the neighborhood at roughly the same time, and initially she had found his demeanor quite off-putting. However, her upstairs neighbor, who seemed to know everything about everyone, had shared that he had moved from Colorado after his son, a mountain rescue team member, had tragically lost his life during a high-risk rescue mission. Tucker had been the young man's rescue dog, and they had worked together as a team for quite some time. In honor of his son, Mr. Johnson had taken in Tucker. Sarah started seeing Mr. Johnson in a different light after hearing a recurring tale. Regardless of her cheerful persona, Mr. Johnson always seemed uninterested in engaging in a conversation. Tucker, his adorable dog, was always comforting to see. Sarah realized that both Mr. Johnson and Tucker genuinely missed the one they loved. Carrying the food for stray cats, while Mr. Johnson walked by her apartment building every morning, a sense of melancholy would wash over her. On a sweltering August morning, Sarah began to worry about Bella, a stray cat that she had named. Bella was a lustrous black cat who was on the brink of motherhood. The initial sight of Bella's plump belly was a surprise for the young woman. Sarah. She constantly tried to get the stray cats accepted into shelters, but to no avail. All shelters were already overpopulated and could offer little help. As much as Sarah wanted to look after Bella post the delivery, she acknowledged that the barren land was inappropriate for a young mother and her kittens. As Sarah started pouring cat food into several bowls scattered across the land, she noticed Bella's absence. It was unusual for Bella, in her condition, to wander far away. Bella was always the first to come over, desiring a belly rub while Sarah prepared the food. Amongst all the strays Sarah fed daily, Bella was indeed the most affectionate. Every brief interaction with Bella made Sarah wish she could take the little feline home. The thought of Bella struggling during her delivery somewhere hidden caused Sarah undeniable anxiety. As she scoured the bushes, there was no sign of Bella. Sarah decided to return after a short while. Working from home, she had the flexibility to follow a strict cat feeding schedule. In the following hours, Sarah found it hard to focus on her work. The worrying thoughts of Bella giving birth on a hot day were overwhelming for her. She decided to shut her laptop and put her shoes on to search for Bella once again. She wouldn't be able to calm her restless mind without finding Bella safe. She spotted Mr. Johnson on her lookout trip, who seemed to be returning from his daily errands. Offering a hurried afternoon greeting, Sarah crossed the road only to hear a monotonous response from Mr. Johnson. Sarah's unusual haste intrigued Mr. Johnson, for he had never seen her like this before. Ever since he'd relocated, avoiding daily conversations with her had become quite a task. Persistent she was, he admitted, but interacting wasn't something he was eager to do, and he'd constantly dismissed her. He now wondered if she would finally discontinue her efforts to engage him in conversation. Upon returning home, Mr. Johnson unlocked the door and placed his groceries down. His loyal dog, Tucker, greeted him in the hall, to which the old man responded by bending down to stroke the dog's ear. Ever since his son's passing, Tucker held practically all of Mr. Johnson's affection. Their shared experience of losing a significant figure in their lives cemented this bond. Every day reminded the two of the person they dearly missed. From the moment his son Carl had been born, he'd become Mr. Johnson's entire universe, and now, in his son's absence, he found himself lost without him. Mr. Johnson and Carl had not only been father and son, but also best pals. Carl's demise left an understandably large void in Mr. Johnson's life. It felt as though he had aged 2 decades in only a few months. When the search and rescue team mentioned that Tucker's performance was compromised without Carl, Mr. Johnson immediately opted to adopt the dog in need. Tucker was his last connecting link with his son, and he had developed a deep bond with the canine. Shortly after these events, the widower and his dog relocated to Florida. The sight of the mountains that took his son was too much for him. Lacking any other family, and intentionally not informing his friends about his relocation, his wish was to be left alone in his sorrow. Hence, the cheerful and always pleasant Sarah became a nuisance. It wasn't comfortably engaging to discuss with a barely known neighbor his extensive dwelling in grief, where the dog played the only motivator for him to face a new day. Sarah's quick afternoon greeting was the first instance she hadn't attempted a prolonged conversation. This shift in her behavior left Mr. Johnson uncertain of his feelings. Walking to his room, Mr. Johnson glanced through his bedroom window. His view consisted of abandoned land and a nearby lake. Spotting the young woman anxiously searching on the deserted land, he furrowed his brows. He was aware she fed some cats there, but today her actions indicated concern. He distanced himself from the window, deeming her behavior none of his business. He was not inclined to start interacting with his neighbors at the moment. Instead, he descended the stairs and unlocked the backyard door for Tucker to unwind. Luckily, his backyard was spacious enough, and a portion of it remained under the shade, serving as a sun shield for Tucker. Unbeknownst to him, he was about to bend his rule of not engaging with neighbors. Everywhere Sarah looked, Bella was nowhere to be found. Her worry escalated every passing minute. This was unusual behavior for Bella, prompting Sarah to fear the worst. A sudden scuffling sound followed by a faint meow froze her on spot. She listened attentively, trying to trace the direction of the noise. She trailed the sound, but the sight that met her eyes filled her with horror. There was a python coiling itself around Bella, the cat she had been frantically searching for. Bella was unable to move, and it was evident that her fight was rapidly dwindling. Sarah was clueless about how to respond. The python was enormous, and though not venomous, Sarah wasn't strong enough to wrestle it alone. Sarah broke into tears, overwhelmed with panic. If she failed to act swiftly, The snake would claim Bella as its prey, along with her kittens. She couldn't bear the thought of losing Bella. Her only options were to distract the snake enough to release its grip, or to search for an object that could aid in Bella's escape. Unfortunately, neither was present. Unable to leave Bella and go in search of help, she resorted to her only option. She cried out for help as loud as she could, a plea soon detected by an unforeseen savior. Back in Mr. Johnson's backyard, Tucker was nestled under a patch of shade when he was jolted by a scream. He sat alert, straining his ears to detect the origin of the sound. Upon hearing the frantic woman's cries, he responded with loud barks. Taken aback, Mr. Johnson ceased his grocery unpacking and inspected Tucker's unusual behavior out the window. Tucker was generally calm and not prone to barking, but his behavior at the moment was evidently startled. The sight of Tucker acting out like this was new to Mr. Johnson. Even when he called Tucker to him from the door, his usually obedient dog overlooked him and continued barking. The situation had unquestionably unsettled Tucker. Mr. Johnson walked towards Tucker, attempting to calm him down. Upon his touch, Tucker hushed and stared at Mr. Johnson. It was as if Tucker was trying to communicate something important to Mr. Johnson. As the barking subsided, he could detect the faint cries for assistance echoing from the uninhabited terrain behind his dwelling. For an instant, the elderly man was uncertain about what action to take. Yet, looking at Tucker's earnest face, it was clear that they had to assist the one calling out in distress. Fastening Tucker's harness, they ventured out of the house, with the dog leading the trail. Observing Tucker, for the first time Mr. Johnson could glimpse the dog's former life as a search and rescue canine. Tucker exhibited the same dedication and focus that his son Carl once did. Their partnership's success was comprehensible, filling Mr. Johnson's heart with a mixture of sorrow and pride. Sarah's voice was growing coarse from shouting. However, her cries seemed to have temporarily halted the snake's constricting squeeze on the expectant cat. Sarah noted that Bella was still breathing, despite being alarmingly still. Bella's body was almost fully enshrouded by the snake. Hearing a dog's distant barking, Sarah was alert. She clung on to the hope that her desperate pleas for help had been heard. The barking hadn't gone unnoticed by the snake either, putting it on high alert. Worrisome thoughts crossed Sarah's mind, considering the potential negative actions the threatened snake might take. With the barking growing louder, the python adopted an aggressive posture, hissing menacingly. As Mr. Johnson and Tucker approached, Sarah hastily wiped away her tears and tried to regain her composure. She was astonished to see the elderly man coming to her rescue. Seeing Tucker, Sarah remembered the dog's glorious past as a search and rescue dog. Surely, the intelligent creature had picked up her cries for help and traced it to her location. Despite the horrifying sight of a python coiling around a pregnant cat, neither Mr. Johnson nor Tucker exhibited fear or shock. Mr. Johnson swiftly grabbed a sturdy stick, and Tucker strained against his harness before facing the snake head-on. What happened next left Sarah in awe. As Mr. Johnson started to wave the stick at the python, Tucker launched into a fierce barking and growling sequence targeted at the intruding snake. Faced with a dog and a man, the python seemed to forget about its captive, Bella. Sarah witnessed with relief as the python began to loosen its tight coil around Bella. Seizing the moment, Sarah rushed in to free Bella just as the python lunged at Tucker. Skillfully, Tucker evaded the python's fangs, while Mr. Johnson kept the snake at bay with the stick. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she clung tightly to Bella. Despite her worry, the little cat was still breathing and seeming not overly distressed. Sarah was consumed by a mixture of relief and overwhelming concern for Bella's unborn kittens. the entire event had been emotionally charged. The potential loss of Bella and her kittens, the unexpected intervention by Mr. Johnson, and Tucker's courageous altercation with the snake had left Sarah emotionally exhausted. In a wordless gesture, Mr. Johnson guided a sobbing Sarah back to his home. Once inside, he placed Bella on a soft blanket, providing her with water and some chicken. For Sarah, he offered a sugary coffee to counteract her shock. As her emotional turbulence started to subside, Sarah couldn't contain her gratitude to Mr. Johnson. She lavishly praised Tucker, who seemed unusually nonchalant, as if it was just another ordinary day. Surprised, Sarah listened as Mr. Johnson revealed his decision to care for Bella until the kittens were born. He reassured her that Tucker harbored no animosity towards the cat, and mentioned he even had a spare room where Bella may comfortably give birth. Once the kittens were ready, he promised to assist Sarah in finding them loving homes. Emotion welled up in Sarah again, threatening to spill over. Awkwardly, Sarah wrestled with a question that lingered in her mind. Hesitant to ask, she pondered Mr. Johnson's possible reaction. In the past few hours, he had truly changed. Even Bella appeared to be at ease with him, relaxing on his lap, contently snoozing. She seemed to have put the frightening encounter with the python behind her. But Mr. Johnson had always been quite reserved. Regardless, Sarah decided to take the risk and invited him for a meal at her place next day, as a token of her appreciation for his assistance. On the brink of declining, Mr. Johnson hesitated, reconsidering the invitation. The events of the day had not only broken his monotonous routine, but shown him his value again. He had helped, and being helpful suspended his perpetual grief. Would dining at Sarah's be necessarily harmful? Thus, for the first time since relocating, Mr. Johnson accepted an invitation. Maybe, he thought, it was high time he ceased his self-imposed social isolation. If the day had taught him anything, it was that he was still relevant in this world, and there were people who genuinely worried about him. He now had not just a faithful canine to rise for, but also a caring cat and a compassionate young woman who might one day become a friend. Now, we turn it over to you. How would you visualize yourself in Sarah's predicament? We are curious about your views, so we'd appreciate if you left us a comment. Appreciate your viewership. We anticipate seeing you in our upcoming video.